first thank Dr. Abbott for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. It's very much appreciated. Did everybody get a handout? If not, there are some.
Can you hear them okay in the back?
I'll speak more loudly when I start saying something worth listening to. It's about now. Well, just as a kind of preface to my prepared remarks, as Dr. Abbott said, this is a very controversial topic. And I'm not sure of my wisdom of venturing into it. Because thus far, the pain has greatly outweighed the pleasure. Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. But nevertheless, I was compelled to delve into this for deeply personal reasons, not that I'm a Lubavitcher, obviously, but just because it's a fascinating contemporary phenomenon that very much related to things that I have been pondering now for many decades. So the topic I chose for today's lecture attempts to consider the problem of time as it relates to the Jewish Messianic ideal. Specifically, my marks are based on the argument I authored in Open Secret, Post-Messianic Messianism and the Mystical Revision of Menachem Mendel Schneerson, published in 2009. Before turning to the Messianic vision of the seventh master of the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidic dynasty, let me begin by framing the question of Messianic temporality more broadly. In a celebrated passage from his commentary on Judah Halevi's poem, Distant Doves Sing Your Song Well, the German Jewish thinker Franz Rosenzweig remarked that the expectation of the Messiah, by which and for the sake of which Judaism lives, would be an empty theologumenon, a mere idea, idle babble, if it were not over and over again made real and unreal, illusion and disillusion in the form of the false Messiah. With characteristic brilliance, Rosenzweig pinpointed a profound dimension of Jewish Messianism. In the annals of Jewish history, anticipation for the true Redeemer has often been intertwined with the possibility of being duped by a false one. Indeed, the latter is, as in Rosenzweig's provocative formulation, the changing form of the enduring Messianic hope. Beyond the contours of a historical argument, Rosenzweig's insight philosophically exposes a deep cut in the fabric of the Jewish apocalyptic imagination. The faith to believe in an allegedly legitimate Savior is severely compromised if the strength of hope not to be deceived by a pretender has been diminished. But it is the very hope not to be deceived that makes the matter of trust possible. Just as Rosenzweig argued in his Star of Redemption that genuine worship requires belief and unbelief, so Messianic expectation is as much dependent on what is presumed to be real as on what is resolved to be so. One might even go so far as to say that the line separating fact and fiction in this domain cannot be sharply drawn. The openness to the future depends on a hope dialectically entwined with the propensity to be deluded. But we are compelled to ask, how does Rosenzweig finally understand the end and the possibility of its coming? It is worth recalling that in the continuation of the aforementioned passage, Rosenzweig recounts a comment that Hermann Cohn, who was one of his teachers, purportedly once made to him. "I'm still hoping to experience the beginning of the Messianic time." Stephen Schwarzschild has expressed doubt regarding the veracity of this attribution, and this seems reasonable to me, given Cohn's steadfast and unambiguous rejection of a personal Messiah and his affirmation of the asymptotic conception of Messianism, which involves the perpetual delay of the occurrence even as it secures its constant potentiality. For our purposes, however, this is not that important, since the remark of Rosenzweig sheds much light on his own eschatological sensibility, and this is our main concern. The refusal to select a specific date for the coming of the Messiah does not simply bespeak deferment of the goal. It intimates the more paradoxical discernment that the goal can only be attained by its never being attained, that the path to the way gives way to the undermining of the way. Rosenstein's eschatology, that is his thinking and discoursing about the eschaton, the end, the messianic end, is marked by an irony that captures the inherent dialectic of Jewish messianism. On the one hand, redemption is predicated on a diremptive temporality that assures the possibility of the future breaking into and being realized in the present. But on the other hand, the future that is realized is precisely what remains incessantly to come. Gershom Scholem came to the same conclusion when he noted that the messianic idea in Judaism is, as he called it, anti-existentialist, since it has, quote, compelled a life lived in deferment, in which nothing can be done definitively, nothing can be irrevocably accomplished. The consolation of Jewish messianism can never be realized except as calamity, and hence its greatness, according to Scholem, is also its constitutional weakness. In the manner of the seventh beggar, in a famous tale by one of the early Hasidic masters, the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, Nachman of Bratslav, the beggar without feet, who is the consummate dancer, is the one beggar not to arrive at a wedding celebration to which all the beggars have been invited. And according to the disciples of Nachman of Bratslav, this consummate dancer, the beggar without feet, is the Messiah, because the Messiah is the one that comes by not coming, the one that is present in the absence of being present. I'm here reminded as well of the observation of Kafka. The Messiah will come only when he is no longer necessary. He will come only on the day after his arrival. He will come not on the last day, but on the very last. Now, what is the distinction between the last day and the very last day? Evidently, the last is not final enough. The very last day is the day after the last, a day that cannot come forth in the ebb and flow of time, any more or less than the first day that would have to come before the first. Now, on your handout, the first passage from Blanchot well expresses the intent of Kafka's insight and the larger implications that one can draw therefrom in assessing the tenor of messianic temporality in Judaism. And I'll quote that. Jewish messianic thought, according to certain commentaries, wrote Blanchot, suggests the relation between the event and its non-occurrence. Both future and past, it is said at least once that the Messiah has already come, his coming does not correspond to any presence at all. And if it happens that to the question, when will you come, the Messiah answers today, the answer is certainly impressive. So it is today. It is now and always now. There is no need to wait, although to wait is an obligation. And when is it now? When is the now which does not belong to ordinary time, which necessarily overturns it, does not maintain but destabilizes it? When? Especially if one remembers that this now, which belongs to no text, but is the now of a severe fictitious narrative, refers to texts that make it once more dependent upon realizable, unrealizable conditions. Every just act makes of its day the last day, or as Kafka said, the very last day, a day no longer situated in the ordinary succession of days, but one that makes of the most commonplace ordinary the extraordinary. Although he does not make the connection explicitly, Blanchot's amplification of Kafka resonates with Kohm's asymptotic notion of the messianic future briefly mentioned above. The intellectual indebtedness is accentuated in the following comment of Schwarzschild, and this is the second passage on the handout, commenting on the 12th of the 13 Maimonidean principles, which is that I believe with full faith in the coming of the Messiah And though he tarry, I anticipate him nonetheless on every day when he may come. That's Maimonides' formulation. And this is Schwarzschild's observation. The logic of this formulation entails that the Messiah will always not yet have come into all historical eternity. It is his coming, or rather the expectation of his coming, not his arrival, his advent, that is obligatory Jewish faith. Jewishly, the Messiah not only has not come, but also will never have come, that he will always be coming. Time and again, Jews have had to confront the belatedness of the Messianic drive. Expressed in what I call hypernomian terms, the fulfillment of the law portends the overcoming of the law that has been fulfilled in its overcoming. The utopian impulse, as it has taken shape within the multifaceted matrix of rabbinic Judaism, requires the resolute adherence to a singular tradition that marks its bearers as a chosen people set apart from other ethnicities. But the actualization of that ideal would perforce blur the boundary between Jew and non-Jew to the point of contesting the very claim to that singularity. That's the dilemma. And you'll see that I'm going to share with you that this was a dilemma at the heart of Schneerson's Messianic vision as well. Now, to raise the question bluntly, is it possible for a Jewish Messiah to be anything but false? Has not the historical record proven definitively that every person proclaimed the Redeemer is eventually judged to be an impostor? Even in the case of the Messianic factions that have had socio-political impact, most notably, of course, the apocalyptic movement surrounding the figure of Jesus, which eventually evolved into the world religion of Christianity. If we factor in events that unfolded in the 20th century after Rosenzweig's demise, the argument is considerably strengthened. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, some Orthodox Jews may still harbor the traditional belief in a personal Messiah, and some religious Zionists may yet suppose that the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 was a harbinger of the end of the exile and the beginning of redemption, a process that presumably will reach its culmination with the restoration of Jews to the land and the construction of the Third Temple in Jerusalem. But I would surmise that the vast majority of Jews involved in some kind of observance, and needless to say, the many more secular Jews estranged from any observance, have lost their ability to be lured by the posturing of a pseudo-Messiah, and hence their faith in the authentic one has been weakened, if not completely eradicated. For most practicing Jews, I would contend, this remains a volatile place where the lines of the political and the theological meet. But it is a site of deep-seated skepticism, as scores of these practitioners presently lack any real confidence that there is one who is coming. The assessment of the thinkers whom I have mentioned, to which many more could have been added, gives voice to what I think of as the tragic optimism coiled within the recesses of Jewish utopianism and the distinctive sense of atemporality implied thereby. The assurance of a future, the tomorrow that can happen today, even at this very moment, may be construed as a source of unending sanguinity, but it cannot be disentangled from the inevitability of its failure. The possibility of the future lies in its already having been the past that can never come to pass as anything but the present that is always passing in its own future as the past. The hope delineated therein cannot be separated from the hopelessness that the hope can never be realized except as the task of remembering the future that persistently stays behind as the past that provisionally stretches ahead. One might counter that it is equally plausible, indeed preferable, to demarcate what I have described as a place of illimitable hope, the interminable interim of a future. So Derrida's achronic conception of time as the coming of the event of a novelty that must surprise, because at the moment when it comes about, there would be no statute, no status, ready and waiting to reduce it to the same. Even though the future is this incalculable alterity, according to Derrida, that for which no horizon of expectation as yet is available, an encounter that escapes all programming, one still must prepare for it. The term invention is employed by Derrida to convey just this sense of getting ready for what cannot be anticipated. Or better, what cannot be anticipated, but as what cannot be anticipated. To let the wholly other come in its irreducible otherness as the iteration of the different. That is written continually like a text, according to Derrida. The thematic connection that links deconstruction and the writing of the future is informed by the Jewish Messianic ideal. In a passage from the Spectres of Marx, that's number 3 on the handout, the influence is acknowledged overtly. Well, what remains, writes Derrida, irreducible to any deconstruction, what remains as undeconstructible as the possibility itself of deconstruction is perhaps a certain experience of the emancipatory promise. It is perhaps even the formality of a structural messianism, a messianism without religion, even a messianic without messianism, an idea of justice which we distinguish from law or right or even from human rights, and an idea of democracy which we distinguish from its current concept and from its determined predicates today. At a later period, Derrida elaborates his appropriation of the Jewish utopianism by referring to messianicity without messianism, by which he intends the opening to the future or the coming of the other as the advent of justice, but without horizon of expectation and without prophetic prefiguration. For Derrida, the promise of Jewish messianism is always more than nothing, but never quite something. Rosenzweig's response to Cohn, I submit, issues from a similar sentiment, an intoxicating mixture of hope and grief. I'm not oblivious to the fact that there are decisive differences between these men, not least of which is Rosenzweig's theocentric framing of redemption in terms of revelation, a point that Derrida explicitly denies. Notwithstanding this disparity, and others that could have been noted, Rosenzweig and Derrida are both keenly attuned to the paradox that the possibility of the future's coming is predicated on the impossibility of its arrival. Like Kafka, and in his wake, Blanchot, they perceive the indeterminacy of the future to be both a source of expectation and disappointment. The apocalyptic calculus rests on the capability of predicting the unpredictable, the prospect of expecting the unexpectable. There is hope in this unsettling of temporal tensiveness, we could say, the irreducible sense of something new implied by the forever differing alterity of what is to come. But at the same time, one must not lose sight of the fact that within certain ideological contexts, a sense of despair might proceed from the awareness that the future can never come, since it must always be coming, that it can only be in the Derridian locution for ghosts. The separation of eschatology and teleology implied by Derrida's sense of a messianic extremity can hardly be accounted a source of inspiration to the person who still adheres to the soteriology of a particular liturgical community. For such an individual, it may simply not be enough, or perhaps it is too much, to bear the truth that the promise will yield nothing but the promise of a promise. Although it might appear improbable, and apparently to many of my readers it has appeared to be improbable, I would suggest that thinking of the eschatological hope as this possibility of the impossible, the possible whose possibility consists of being impossible, can serve as a valuable lens through which to examine the religious philosophy of Menachem, Mendel, Schneerson. Much of the scholarly and popular attention to Schneerson has been focused on whether or not he identified himself as the Messiah, as Jesse mentioned in his opening remarks. While this interest is surely understandable, both textually and anthropologically, in my opinion, it obscures the crucial question concerning the nature of the messianism he promulgated. On the surface, this line of inquiry seems gratuitous for two reasons. First, his writings, discourses, and actions are replete with references to a personal Messiah, the righteous Redeemer who would come and lead the Jewish people out of exile to the land of Israel. And since there is no evidence that he ever deviated from the strictures of rabbinic orthodoxy, there should be no reason to cast doubt on his explicit assertions. Second, a distinguishing feature of Chabad ideology, in consonance with the more general drift of Hasidism as a spiritual phenomenon, beginning in the second half of the 18th century, is the ostensible commitment to divulging mystical secrets, the interiority of the law, or the spreading of the wellsprings outward to circulate the mysteries that impart the knowledge of divinity necessary for proper worship. Prima facie, it would appear that Chabad breaks the code of esotericism upheld in theory, if not unfailingly in practice, by Kabbalists through the centuries. There is little question that this is the self-understanding endorsed by the Seventh Rebbe as well, and consequently there would be little justification to suspect him of insincerity. However, the historical picture is far more complex. One should never forget that Schneerson was heir to a long-standing esoteric tradition, according to which things are not always as they seem to be, nor do they always seem to be what they are. The role of secrecy in his teaching endures both in content and in form. Even though he was overtly dedicated to the indiscriminate diffusion of esoteric matters, Schneerson remains beholden to the hermeneutic principle attested in much earlier sources. A secret can only be divulged as a secret if it is a secret that is divulged. To be revealed as secret, the secret revealed must be concealed. But to be concealed as secret, it must be revealed. Therefore, we can speak of inherent duplicity in the dissemination of secrets, the enfolding of the secret as secret, the withholding of the exposure, and the exposure of the withholding. For Schneerson, as for many masters of the Jewish esoteric wisdom that preceded him, the ploy of secrecy is especially operative in the realm of Messianic speculation. If one bears this in mind, then it should not be difficult to heed the argument that employing the standard ways of referring to Messiah does not necessarily mean allegiance to a literal interpretation. So we have arrived at a spot where my approach diverges most conspicuously from the work of others. In my judgment, Schneerson was intentionally ambiguous about his own identity as Messiah, since the key aspect of his teaching involves cultivating a modification in consciousness with respect to this very issue. Simply put, the image of a personal Messiah may have been utilized rhetorically to liberate one from the belief in the personal Messiah. The true Messiah will be the one to reveal that there is no Messiah. The millenarian enthusiasm that fueled Schneerson's mission from its inception is about fostering the true expansion of knowledge, an epistemological shift, parallel with a change in cosmological orientation, how one looks upon the world, marked by progressively discarding all veils in an effort to see the veil of truth unveiled in the truth of the veil, which is physical nature. If reality, when perceived through the eyes of mystical gnosis, mystical knowledge, is a coalescence and unification of opposites, and that's the direct language that he uses, hitkalut v'hitachtut hahafachim. The original non-ground, or the essence, that is neither light nor dark, as both light and dark are nullified in the sameness of their indifference, then the logic vital to uphold the binary distinctions that are basic to the social and communal fabric of the Jewish tradition, holy and profane, permissible and forbidden, Jew and non-Jew, is to be transcended. The future redemption, in contrast to the exodus from Egypt, is described by Schneerson as a manifestation of the aspect of boundlessness, and hence the praxis that is preparation for it must partake of the same quality, which he calls the worship of repentance, to be distinguished from the worship of law and commandments, a form of service that is bound by the canon of obligatory and deplorable. The idea is that repentance, according to the rabbinic tradition, when one repents, one has the capacity to elicit divine forgiveness, which is expressed as turning guilt into innocence, which is an utterly paradoxical idea. It defies the measure of the law itself, because by the law one is either guilty or innocent. But forgiveness, occasioned by repentance, has this quality of touching on, turning one thing into its opposite. And that's the quality of the worship that Schneerson spoke of as characteristic of the Messianic moment, as opposed to worship of Torah and Mitzvot, the law and the commandments, based on permissible and forbidden. So the worship appropriate to the Messianic epoch is also described by Schneerson as an ecstatic state of frenzy, or what he calls the folly of holiness, of holiness that is above reason and knowledge. Alternatively expressed, the characterization of the worship appropriate to the Messianic epoch is the worship of the aspect of what he calls yechidah, right, which means unification. It's a dimension of the soul, according to their teaching, which is unique to the Jewish people, and in virtue of which the Jews can be united with the one true essence. Now, text number 4 on your handout is an elaboration of this theme, which was delivered, interestingly enough, on the 8th day of Passover in the year 1987. And the 8th day of Passover, Passover celebrates the Exodus from Egypt. So in Chabad, the Chabad custom is to have on the 8th day a third Seder, which is called the Sudat Mashiach, the meal of the Messiah. Because, right, as the ancient Israelites were redeemed in Nisan, the month of Passover, so the future redemption will take place in Nisan. So this is a talk he delivered on the 8th day of Passover in 1987, number 4. All the revelations of the future to come are dependent on our actions and on our worship during the whole duration of the exile. From this can be understood that the disclosure of the splitting of the river is also in the present. That means crossing the river Jordan into the land. And it must be said that this is by means of the worship in the aspect of Yechidah, for the distinctive matter of the Messiah is what is in the aspect of Yechidah. And the matter of worship can be understood from this, worship in the aspect of Yechidah, to unify you, which is connected to the single one of the world. This matter is revealed on the last day of Passover. There's much to extract from this passage, but let me just emphasize that the eschatological consequence of the monotheistic mandate to unify God is that the Jewish soul, or the aspect of the Jewish soul called Yechidah, will be bound to and incorporated within the single one of the world, which is to say the one in which there is no more division, the one about which it is even too limited to say that it is one. Now I know parenthetically that this casts a spotlight on the blind spot of the system on the whole. Because only the Jew, as it were, has what it takes to be nothing. In Chabad, accordingly, we have a mystical discipline predicated on a non-egocentric philosophy that is at the same time culturally ethnocentric. One might have expected that the two to have been coupled, such that the breeding of egocentricity on the psychological plane is the efficient cause that engenders the propagation of ethnocentricity on the anthropological. But it is also possible, as the example of Chabad illustrates, to decouple the two. Be that as it may, in the non-dual meta-consciousness, the contrast between truth and untruth is itself no longer viable, and thus the axiological basis of the Nomian perspective, the life of Jewish law, would have to be subjected to a radical transvaluation. And this is expressed by Schneerson using a much older motif from Kabbalistic sources in terms of the Messianic Torah being related to the tree of life, in contrast to the Torah which is operative now, which is related to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Right? So obviously the tree of knowledge is based on polarity between good and evil, permissible and forbidden, but the Torah of the tree of life is a Torah that exceeds that polarity, and we could speak of it therefore as the law beyond the law. From this, the consequence of this lawfulness beyond the law clearly is a challenge to the enframing of Judaism as it has been practiced for thousands of years. There's no way around it, right, if we're going to be honest. And from that vantage point, the pledge about a messianic future is invariably a put-on, or the putting off of what is forthcoming. It can't come, because if it comes, it undoes the ground that bears it. This is the dilemma. This is the problem. At the most extreme, one might be tempted to think of the eschatological drama as a cover-up, a dogmatic cloak in which to envelop the truth that there is no Messiah for whom we must wait. The pretense of describing the end as the full disclosure of the essence without any garment, a seeing of the divine light as it is manifested in the garb of the material world, which disappears finally to reveal its concealment. And indeed, there are passages where Schneerson does describe this concluding expose, as it were, at the fringe of time, as the showing of this occlusion, right? Where we come to realize that the world is the concealment of the infinite essence, right? And it concealed by revealing the concealment. By revealing the concealment is revealed. Right? So the way I argue in the book is that though the ostensible goal is to see without a veil, what that really amounts to is coming to see that there is no seeing except through a veil. Right? There's an old Sufi teaching, right? For the Sufis, right? The mystical path is often troped as an uncovering or unveiling of the veil, to see the face without a veil. But the Sufis were wise to this dialectic as well, and some of them spoke of the greatest of veils is to think that one can see without a veil. So that the final unveiling is to realize that we always see through a veil. And that's Schneerson's teaching as well, in my opinion. And the ultimate veil is the material world. So seeing without a garment, in other words, consists of coming to see that there is nothing to see but the garment, that one can see without any garment. That's mystical insight. And the tragedy of Schneerson's Messianic campaign can be gauged by the rituals performed by some of his followers to render his absence present, a denial of the facticity of his mortality, based on a construction of time that blurs the past and the present, in the hopes of compelling an appearance in the future. Ironically, such behavior, which ensues from a literalizing of the Seventh Rebbe's language, perpetuates the exilic consciousness that his teaching sought to overcome. What is seemingly lost to those who follow this path is the realization that true vision consists of seeing the invisible in the visible, and not of seeing the non-visible as visible. This is the import of Schneerson's repeated insistence that the Messiah is already here, and all that is necessary is for people to open their eyes in order to greet him. Post-mortem apparitions of the Seventh Rebbe, by contrast, are indicative of a profound spiritual blindness. It is undeniable that Schneerson preached sincerely that one must prepare for the occasion of the Messianic coming. even following Maimonides by classifying the act of waiting as a positive commandment mandated by the Torah. And thus he desperately and recurrently urged his followers to believe in the possibility of the realization of the promise at any moment. Epitomized in a Yiddish incantational chant that occurs frequently in his teachings, Ot Ot Kumt Mashiach, verily, verily, let the Messiah come. Or in an English equivalent that he started to use in the 70s and 80s, we want Mashiach now. Existentially, however, this now is an occasion that can never take place, a non-event that defies temporal location. If it is to come, it is because it presently is what has already been. To substantiate this point, it is imperative to recall that the Chabad conception of time is such that the quintessential aspect of temporality is the moment in which there is a compressence of past, present, and future, an idea that is adduced as the metaphysical import of the most sacred of God's name in the Jewish tradition, the Tetragrammaton. He was, he is, and he will be. The Chabad masters delimit the now as an atemporal presence in which the three temporal modalities coalesce. Just as we say of the divine that he reigned, he reigns, and he shall reign, not sequentially, but concurrently, since God is above time. From the standpoint of the infinite, all time is comprised in what they call the little moment, or the minuscule moment, the rega katan, the smallest of demarcations, the infinitesimal point that contains all difference indifferently. It is not coincidental that Schneerson spoke of the coming of the Messiah in terms of this rega katan, this infinitesimal point, the interlude of time that cannot be measured in time, in and through which, quote, we will exit from slavery to freedom, to the great light, in the true and complete redemption through our righteous Messiah. Now, I'm going to skip. I have more textual data here to flesh out this idea, but I think I'm going to skip over it. So the portal through which the future is to come, as Schneerson expresses in some of his writing, some of his discourses, is less than a blink of an eye. Less than a blink of an eye, what we might translate into contemporary terms as a nanosecond. That is denoted as the original moment of creation. So it's interesting here, right? Just as the creation came to be in this moment which cannot be measured in time, similarly the redemption portends this moment that cannot be calibrated in time. And remarkably, he says, it is the aspect that is above the boundary of time but revealed in time. In time, though not in time. The full paradox. In time, but not in time. So this paradox, in time but not in time, bizman ach eno bizman, indicates that the moment in which the lines of creation, revelation, and redemption meet cannot be measured temporally, no matter how refined our tools of analytic computation. And hence, mathematically, there is no way to think of its occurrence but as the occurrence of what cannot occur, save in the non-occurrence of its occurrence. The time of redemption is this timeless moment, which cannot transpire temporally, and therefore must always be capable of occurring intemporally. And this is the nuance of a repeated formulation of Schneerson, that the Messiah should come immediately and without delay. And he speaks of this as well as the impossible possible. The impossible possible, his language. Okay, again, I'm skipping some more text. Turn to number 5 on the handout. This is from a discourse that he gave rather late in his life, October 14, 1991. There is nothing more for which to wait, he said, since all matters of worship have been completed and they have already repented. Remember we said that the future is dependent on worship of repentance. All that is necessary, the matter is dependent solely on the coming of the Messiah himself. All that is necessary is that the Messiah should actually come in reality. Small matter. One should point with one's finger and say, this is our righteous Messiah. The essence is that this should be immediately and without delay in actuality. Tekef umiyad mamash. As I have said and repeated many times, it is not only that the terminus of the redemption is to come, but that the redemption is already standing at the entrance of the door, and it is waiting for each and every Jew to open the door and to usher the redemption into the room. Here again I note a striking affinity between Schneerson and Rosenzweig. Commenting on another poem by Judah Halevi, Asleep but his heart was awake, Rosenzweig described the final vision, Messianic vision, as one in which, quote, only the purely present future speaks. The call, the be ready of the hour that has come, finally come. Is it not gratuitous to write of an invocation to beseech others to be ready for an hour that has come? Would it not be more sensible to expect that the future for which one is summoned to be ready is the future that is to come, not one that has finally come? And yet, Messianic hope, in the notorious articulation of Walter Benjamin, the decree to remember the past incumbent upon the Jew, which turns every second into a narrow gate through which the Messiah might enter, hinges on the paradox of preparing for the onset of what has transpired. The purely present future, the future that is already present, as the present that is always future. The tomorrow that is now, precisely because it is now tomorrow. There is more to say about this story, but I've already taken too much of your time, so I will bring the matter to a close. To sum up the main drift of the argument, there is no question that Schneerson's writings and oral discourses, through the duration of his leadership, but with intense urgency in his twilight years, are replete with references to the imminent coming of a personal Messiah, a belief that he viewed as essential to the mission of Chabad, to fulfill the spiritual destiny of Hasidism, according to the mandate of the Baal Shem Tov, to divulge the mystical secrets that impart knowledge of divinity necessary for proper worship. Previous discussions of the Rebbe's Messianism have applied a literalist approach to his words and actions regarding this matter, neglecting to consider more carefully his indebtedness to the tradition of Kabbalistic esotericism. My approach has been to examine Schneerson's teaching by taking seriously that he adopted an inherent duplicity with regard to the dissemination of secrets. It would be ludicrous to deny that his writings and discourses are suffused with the jargon of the traditional eschatology, which typically I've been criticized for doing, even though I say in the book countless numbers of times what I just read to you. It doesn't matter. Okay. Without hopelessness, there's no hope. Ostensibly, his conception of the true and complete redemption included the belief in the coming of the Davidic Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the rebuilding of the third temple. This is obvious. And one could, as some have already done, fill many volumes, copying and explicating the relevant citations. The assignment I set for myself has been different: to investigate whether, beyond the didactic veneer, one can glimpse a postmodern posture that resonates with the satirical wisdom of Kafka. The Messiah will come on the day after he has arrived, on the day after he is needed, not on the last day, but on the very last day imagined as what cannot be imagined. To be enlightened messianically is to be delivered from all conceptual limitations. And this includes the limitation of the very notion of being delivered from limitation. The ultimate emancipation, therefore, the true and complete redemption, consists of being reintegrated into the infinite essence beyond all duality, even the duality of being emancipated and not emancipated. As an emancipation, in other words, that emancipates one from the bind of emancipation. Taking the matter of masquerade one step further, at the deepest level, Schneerson's eschatological orientation entailed the discernment that a spiritual master, if he be true, must dispose of the mask of mastery. And just yesterday, I found a passage where he says the word Rebbe should not be applied to just him, it can be applied to everybody. The very term master can be applied to everybody. Exactly what I just read. Indeed, according to the didactic model set forth by the Rebbe, the supreme level is to be the donor and the recipient concomitantly, to overflow by receiving and to receive by overflowing. The real master, or teacher, knows that the gesture of giving is in the ability to take, that the most potent wellspring is the vessel that contains. It is important to recall this as the last passage. The much discussed comment of Schneerson in a talk delivered spontaneously after evening prayers on April 11, 1991, the 28th of Nisan. After expressing the perplexity regarding the delay of the Messianic coming and sharing his doubt about the desire of the Jewish people for the redemption, he infamously announced to his Hasidim, "I have done what I can, and from now on you must do all that is in your power, or your capacity. And let it be the will of God that there will be 1, 2, or 3 of you who may suggest what to do and how to do it. But the essence is that you should act so that the true and complete redemption will be realized in actuality, immediately and without delay in actuality, and through joy and good-heartedness." Many have marveled at the apparent tone of resignation in this statement, but what has not been appreciated is the extent to which the theme of shifting responsibility to others to accelerate redemption is perfectly consistent with the approach of the 7th Rebbe and also his predecessor, his father-in-law, the 6th Rebbe. The undoing of the master-disciple hierarchy, as a matter of fact. Consequently, there cannot be a Rebbe succeeding the 7th. For if there is an 8th Rebbe, he is precisely the one whom no one can or should follow. The ultimate legacy of the 7th Rebbe, the encrypted message he wished to bequeath to future generations, lies in proffering an understanding of salvation as the 8th, the expanded consciousness of and reabsorption into the infinite essence, an essence that resists essentialization, the moment of eternity for which we await in its fully temporalized sense, the advent of the absolute non-event. True liberation on this score would consist of being liberated from the need to be liberated. So by way of conclusion, let me note that in the post-Job and secret, I juxtapose 2 quotes to serve as the epigraph. The first from the 6th Rebbe of Chabad, Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. Yet a tug sagt epis, yet a tug is a tug, which means every day speaks of a possibility, every day is a day. Meaning seize the day, in other words. And the second from Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man. Let me forget about today until tomorrow. Ostensibly, the 2 comments clash. One demands attentiveness to the inherent potency of each day without any impediment. The other championing procrastination by seeking to forget about today until tomorrow. Upon further consideration, however, it seems that both dicta well express the hopeless hope of the Messianic expectation. To seize the moment, one must postpone the time of today until tomorrow. But tomorrow soon enough becomes another today that must be postponed to usher in another tomorrow. In spite of, or perhaps due to the soundness of this contention, it is incumbent upon us to shake loose of the temptation to view the temporal sway of our experience as insufferably auspicious, stimulated, as Foucault expressed it, by our experience of the rhythmic time marked by oscillations, a seasonal time where absence is always a pledge of return, and death a pledge of resurrection. The hope imparted by the Messianic dream, indeed by the dreamscape more generally, renews itself sporadically as the hope deferred perpetually. Neither pessimism nor optimism seem apposite to categorize the surpassing of hope, to which I allude, in professing the bequeathing of hope in the dream through its adjournment, a sentiment that circumvents the adjudication of an axiological approach basic to our navigating the currents of the world. As Heraclitus mused, he who does not expect will not find the unexpected, for it is trackless and unexplored. Perhaps it is hopeless to imagine letting go of the inclination to hope. But then we would do better to think of hope as the unremitting projection of an elementally calibrated retrospection to foretell what has been in the recollection of what is to come. Every undertaking on this score would be a return of what can never be, but what can never be. The loop of a double negative that yields the positivity of our becoming the being we are not. A pension well understood through time by mystic visionaries and contemplative masters. In the bleak wit of Leonard Cohen, though your promise count for nothing, you must keep it nonetheless. Wittingly or not, the poet has encapsulated the hopelessness of Messianic hope, the darkness that relentlessly inflames the renewal of life.
I'd like to ask the audience if you'd like to pose any questions about Wolfson. Please do so. He's more than happy to answer some questions.
It's not now, when? Yeah.
One of the things that occurred to me is that there are some parallels. I'm sorry. There's some parallels with the thinking of Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. The way you know it, but when you know it, it actually is no longer the way. And have you pondered that or thought about that?
Yeah. Well, I have. In the book, there's a particular part of the book where I actually do quite a bit of comparative analysis with some Mahayana Buddhist ideas about the nothing. And, so I have very much pondered that the logic at work here has an analogy to. I didn't specifically mention that text, but of course the historically, the logic of Mahayana Buddhism, which eventually infuses Zen Buddhism, has an older echo to what you're referring to. So, yeah, I have thought about it. Yeah.
Can you explain what he meant by the personal Messiah? I haven't heard that.
Well, that's just the point of complexity. He uses, no doubt, the rhetoric of a personal Messiah. We want Mashiach now, right? But when you plumb into the teaching, right, and this goes back to the first of the Chabad Lubavitch masters, right? Because it's a very intricate intertextual tradition. They all build upon one another, right? When you look carefully at the way they describe the Messiah, it's connected to that aspect of Yechidah that I talked about. And the aspect of Yechidah is decidedly impersonal. It's the aspect of the soul through which one is integrated into the infinite, and there's a dissolution of any sense of egocentricity. Now, so I would say, look, I know that my thesis was going to meet with great resistance. I understand that. But I would say to those who don't want to accept what I have to say, it's still a burden on them to explain that point that I just said. And if it turns out that we have here simply an incoherent picture, that's fine. But we have to get to that point to acknowledge it. There's no way you can have all of those teachings that are about a messianic consciousness where there's a dissolution of self and then and an overcoming of boundaries such that there's no longer a distinction between light and dark, Jew and non-Jew, good and evil, permissible and forbidden, and then think of it as somehow being instantiated in the world.
You know, this is fascinating. I think, though, it sounds like the tradition of Christ. You know, in John 10, you know, when he's saying, "I and the Father are one," you know, that whole tradition that you're just saying, it sounds congruent. Though his thesis then was not accepted, just as yours is not. You know, though I'm a Muslim, I'm not trying to say but I'm saying that thesis, it seems to me, is in the parable that Jesus.
Well, I appreciate that comment. Of course, we have to be careful about, because it's a very delicate point. But I would concur with you, and I would say, working through, right? This is an inner logic of Jewish messianism that has worked itself out at different historical junctures. Schneerson is our most recent example of it.
When you were talking about the non-existent eighth rabbi at the end there,
Yeah.
I flashed on the words of Jesus again. The kingdom of heaven is within you.
What?
The kingdom of heaven is within you.
Yeah.
So maybe he meant it, you know.
Jesus or Schneerson?
Maybe one's challenging the other.
Neither of them have ever lied to me.
Nor to me.
I'm fascinated with the concept of time and not time, non-time. And if the eschatological end of time is never the culmination of the future, would I be correct in saying that that's comparable to a mathematical infinity?
That's Cohn's asymptotic future. That's what Cohn meant.
Okay.
I think Schneerson's take is a little bit different, because it's the asymptotic future means you can forever approach it, but you can never reach it. Right? Schneerson's point is that tomorrow is now, because now is tomorrow.
Yeah, it's infinity. I mean, it's...
Well, it's infinity, but there's a sense in which infinity is instantiated in the present in a way that Cohn did not...
Singularity.
Yeah, huh?
It's more of a singularity.
Schneerson.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but there's a see, that's the difference. For Cohn, it can never, that's exactly right. There can never be a consummation of the future. It's always deferred.
It's always, right.
Whereas I think actually Schneerson's teaching is precisely the opposite. Right? It's a non-event, to be sure, but it's a non-event that occurs as a non-occurrence. Now,
I'm wondering if you could make a connection between two things that you referred to in his thought. One is the atemporal, or the sort of the non-worldly, non-time-oriented view, or kind of a different way of thinking about time that isn't familiar to most people.
Right.
And the other thing that you mentioned being his sort of the apparent inconsistencies in his thought. And I'm wondering if you could see a connection between those two things, or comment on a possible connection between those two things in relation to the fact that there is another inconsistency, which is that Lubavitch, which seems to be operating in this sort of non-worldly context, or this interior context, it was so political, so invested in political activism,
yeah.
in very deliberate and calculated ways. And
Absolutely.
is there some, you know?
Absolutely, that's a very good point. I don't have a really good answer for that, other than to say this is one of the real peculiarities of the man. He did get very much, as you say, very much involved in politics local politics, more broadly speaking, in the American landscape, and of course in Israel. So I don't know how to put those pieces together. All I can say is that that has to be acknowledged. I simply have not found anywhere where he renders a coherent picture with regard to that. But here, what is required is an intensification of the paradox. And so the biggest chapter in the book is chapter 2, which I call, I have the term apophatic embodiment, which is a completely difficult locution. But to transmit it in the simplest way I can. Let me do it this way. There's this old Zen teaching. Right? First there was a mountain, and then there was no mountain, and then there is a mountain. So that's very much Chabad, right? That first you have the material world, the political world, right? The world of the body and all that's involved. And then you come, right? Then you come to see that that world is an illusion. It's a veil, right? Because what is really real is this infinite essence. But then you come to reappropriate that the world is paradoxically that infinite essence. There's a word, the word ha'olam, the world, is written in a certain way that allows the Chabad masters to vocalize it as he'elim, concealment. So the world, what does it mean to say that the world is concealment? It means to say that this infinite essence, right, obviously cannot be identified as the world until one realizes that it can't be identified as the world, and then one realizes that it is the world. So that's the spot where we have to reflect to get the answer to your question. So being involved in the world politically is driven from that. But I still can't put together all the pieces because ultimately, this Messianic vision would undo the Judaism that he practiced.
But it would seem the very insolubility of this is part of the message. I mean, as frustrating as that sounds, to say or hear that, that you have passages in the Zohar which claim that something like he for whom the Torah is only understood literally, that person might just as well never have been born, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What does that really mean? There still is going to be the person who does understand things. Is there any way to solve those kinds of problems? And is there any way to solve the immediacy of having to act, to have agency in the world? If it's a non-dual frame, it's just an insoluble situation. I guess I'm suggesting maybe that's not within that framework of the problem. It's a problem, but the insolubility is not necessarily.
There's a good point. Good point.
I'm not sure if it's a good point.
But well, it's a good point, but it's one that spins the head around. But maybe that's the point.
It seems like a cop out that I can't get out of. I can't get out of that formulation.
Yeah. I figured first.
Yeah, so following on Professor Abbott's idea, though, if you can't get out of it, but you get out of it by staying in it and staying in the world with your praxis, your worship, your action in the world, your moral agency. But if the future is always coming but never arriving, along with the Messiah, then the Messiah may be the practitioner, and ultimately, the changes that the practitioners bring about bring about all of those dissolution of the binaries, the good, the evil, the Jew, the non-Jew, and so the issue of politics and action in the world may eventually work itself out into something that looks very different.
Maybe, but when one scrutinizes his actions in the world, which I think was, I'm sorry, I don't know people's names, it's decidedly not Messianic in the way that you just described it. But what the potential for it to ensue from his teachings, yes, I quite agree with you. So there's a surplus to him which exceeds his own vessel.
Actually, just a couple of observations in relation to the moment or nanosecond of creation redemption strikes me as almost nirvana. Would that be an apt observation?
In the Mahayana tradition, they eventually say there's no difference between nirvana and samsara. So to the extent that there's no difference between the cycle of birth and death and the liberation therefrom, I agree with you. But that's just another way of saying first there was a mountain, then there was no mountain.
We came up with that line that this became. In relation, the other comment that Rabbi made in terms of the identity of the Messiah, it seems to be suggesting that the Messiah is within everyone.
Correct. That's exactly the
Would
message.
that be at the moment of redemption, or is that a constant? Or is there any clarity?
That I think is at the heart of the teaching.
Mm-hmm.
When that is discerned, maybe that's also what you intended.
Yeah.
When that is discerned, then the Messiah has done the Messiah's job.
Right. And it just strikes me also that within Christian literature, you have Jesus in Matthew and in Mark's Gospel especially, echoing the Messianic secret. But at the end, it's revealed, whereas the Rebbe chose not to, or suggested that the Messiah is within all of us.
Right. Very deeply Jewish idea.
Yeah, exactly.
That Messianic
Jesus.
secret.
Part of
Coming at it from a different direction, it strikes me also that part of the paradox here is that ultimately the final lifting of the veil is to recognize that it's the veil.
Right.
Isn't this also the paradox is this is the evaporation of mysticism, because in fact we're simply back here and it's existential. We're just here. And that all the rest of this is simply got us back to recognizing, oh, here we are.
Unless mysticism is to recognize the ordinary as extraordinary, and not to escape from the ordinary. But if you set it up as a kind of fleeing from or escape from, yes, it would be. Actually, I'm more inclined to what you said than my response. Yes, I do think. In one of my books, I say that mysticism is the path to venture beyond the path by walking the path. But I think ultimately mysticism itself is requires undoing.
The quotes that you gave us were all from the end of his life?
No. I only selected very few. I mean, the book has got hundreds of quotes, but no. No, not really. The two of them.
April 87 and 91 is...
Yeah, two of them are relatively from the end. Yeah.
Well, was there, over the course of his life, was there much evolution in his thought? Is there like somewhere else that he started and he moved to this near?
The first, what Chabad considers his inaugural address, which was on the anniversary of the death of his predecessor in 1951. He gave a talk. It's a long story. The talk is complicated because it's connected to the last talk that his predecessor distributed. And the day that he distributed it, he was distributing it because of the anniversary of the death of his own mother, and it turned out that he passed away on that day. It's complicated. But anyhow, the point is that the focal point of that talk was about this tradition of 7 righteous men from Abraham to Moses. And then he connects it to the lineage of Chabad, that he was taking on, finally after months of deliberation, he was taking on the responsibility to be like the leader. Although he, throughout his whole life, he continued to refer to his father-in-law as the leader of our generation. He never claimed for himself the status of the Rebbe. So that's important. And even on his tombstone, it says, it's engraved in stone, he filled the place of his father-in-law. So, to answer your question, is from the get-go, he saw his taking on this responsibility as the culmination of what came before him. There's no question that the 7th, being Moses, is an allusion to the Messiah, because Moses is called the first Redeemer, and the Messiah is the final Redeemer. And this was continuous through his life, but I do admit that in the 80s and in the early part of the 90s, the language intensifies. There's no question that it intensifies. And it's more and more overt and more, with more urgency. But it's there from the beginning.
Regarding the idea of the Messiah being within the individual, once you rob the concept of a Messiah of sort of, physical and temporal existence, what exactly is the difference between a Messiah and just God?
I'm not following that. If it's, say it again.
Well, because there's the idea that God is within all of us. And if there's no actual physical occurrence along with the Messiah.
Okay. No, I got it. Well, again, to go back to that idea of the Yechidah is the aspect of the soul in virtue of which there's no more distinction between the finite human being and the infinite. And that's exactly right. So there is no more difference. Messianic consciousness is attaining this state of divinity which is predicated on the abrogation of the ego self, becoming absorbed or incorporated into the infinite essence, which is beyond all distinction, or alternatively it's described as where there is no more distinction between opposites because opposites are identical.
But it seems to me that works just as well without a Messiah. That almost seems redundant at that point.
Well, the problem is that he was Jewish. And he had to work with the cloth of the tradition. I don't disagree with you philosophically, but he's laboring with the weight of the traditional tropes, That's what he has to work with. That's the material he works with. I skipped the part where I talk about Purim. Purim was his favorite holiday. Why? Because Purim, every holiday becomes Messianic, to some, right, including Passover. But Purim, because what about Purim? Purim is the point to which there is an identity of opposites. There's a rabbinic tradition. One has to become inebriated to the point that one no longer knows the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Right? So when the hero and the villain become identical, for Schneerson, this was the Messianic message par excellence. So it's a coincidentally opposite term.
So this whole notion that the Messiah exists sort of outside time, with the whole, he's always, what's to say, he's just the Messiah, I guess.
Right.
So this perpetual coming but never arriving, that's kind of an outside of time thing, right? So if someone is outside of time, how is the Messiah, being outside of time, supposed to arrive in time, given that he's never arrived? Does that make sense?
Yes, well. As much as anything else other than but that relates to the question. It's precisely, I went over this too quickly probably. It's the tetragrammaton, right, which is the compressence of past, present, and future, which provides the model for temporality. So the one who attains this messianic state, right, is seeing things from that divine perspective, where there is no more difference between the three temporal modes, because they're all present. Now, but just what was tricky, I think, and it's partly my fault in the way I delivered it, because two things are going on here. There's one fleshing out his teaching, and the other is my reflection on it, right, which is a little bit more despairing than his own teaching. Because I just wonder how can this, actually be informative of a moment in Jewish history and world history by implication. So I'm saying there is there's something tragic here. Once again, we have the expression of a Jewish messianism which can't be instantiated in time without undermining itself. But that's my reflection. I think it's part what I think he was getting at that in that spontaneous talk. When he said, "I've done all I can, and from now on it's up." I mean, it was sort of he was saying.
Can't help it.
Yeah.
Another quick thing. So, something you said while you were answering that question was that messianism is something to be attained. So that's sort of akin to enlightenment, isn't it? So technically, ideally, that would be available to everyone, which brings it back to the idea of if everyone attains messianism, then the Messiah becomes present in every individual. So is that some sort of ultimate goal?
I think that is his teaching. But again, the difficulty that I have, and what I struggle with, is that it would have to extend to overcoming all of those boundaries. It is that non-dual consciousness, right, which would require dissolving distinctions, which have been vital, right, to maintaining Judaism sociologically as a distinct phenomenon. That's the problem.
So the attainment would have to be contained in itself within Judaism.
But it can't.
Yeah.
And
that's what's stopping it from happening. All right.
When in Jewish history does the concept of the Messiah enter, and how does it?
It's in the Second Temple period, and then in the Rabbinic period. But of course, it's based on biblical. They ground it in biblical texts, but it's clearly articulated for the first time in the 2nd century BCE or so, around that time, and developed its own momentum.
There's this movie that's been going on in my head while I'm listening to these questions, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with that movie V, in which there's a veiled character who's got a mask. V? V?
B-E or B?
B, the letter B.
Oh, just the letter B, okay. Yeah.
Well, there's basically a character, a Messianic type character, who has taken the role of trying to unveil reality. We don't know how, what he's going to do. But he goes through this entire movie, and at the end, he finds a way for the larger society to take on the same role that he's been taken on, in a superficial way in some manner, and present to them a larger picture. And in the last few moments of that movie, they all are his character. And then it dissolves when there's this larger event, this revelation. And then they are back to themselves. They take off their mask. They are back to themselves. But they are in some ways changed.
Transformed.
but they're still back to who they are.
Right.
But then again, they were also waiting for an event. The entire time, we never knew what the event was. There was this anticipation. And the thing is that this was going to be an annual event. So there's going to be this constant anticipation. It's something that was interesting to me only because there are other traditions where you do take on a role that dissolves.
Yeah.
And even as an actor, you have that kind of very difficult situation where you do take on a role and you have to allow it to dissolve once it's over. But that was just what's playing through my mind.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's it seems
Hearing.
very, very
A
appropriate.
movie to see.
Seems very appropriate.
Take maybe one or two more questions? What would you like?
This is just a thought of faith that must be required.
I mean,
The faith that must
faith.
be required
Uh-huh.
to believe in this tradition must be heroic. Or
on
perhaps
the part of Schneerson or his followers or the scholars or.
Right. Or, one could say blind also, but I think
Yeah.
it's heroic
Yeah.
and back to your point of being tragic.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think I don't believe, I mean, what do I know, but I don't believe there's going to be a Rebbe following the seventh Rebbe. I think that's it. It's not going to be the end of Chabad. The institutions are in place that it can go on for a long time. There's also video of the Rebbe, which is, sustained his presence in a very intense way. But I also think, except for a few individuals, and eventually this will, I believe, fade, Messianism will be cut out of it. Now some, I have to say, there have been some Chabad Lubavitchers who have responded to me. And they might not necessarily agree with everything, especially the use of Buddhism. That touches a nerve. But they do see, I have to admit this, that they do see that I was trying to get from in the inside and provide what could possibly be one way to deal with all this stuff, to save face. But I don't think the traditional idea of the Messiah, I think it's gone. So it's just one more example of, it's really the third rail of Judaism. All right.